I was forgetting about that. Esse projeto ela atua na Universidade de Oxford, é um projeto interdisciplinar, tem aplicações práticas, envolve departamentos diferentes, mas visa tratar desenvolvimento de virtudes. Ela tem diversas publicações na área de epistemologias de virtudes e com esse foco que a gente deseja aqui relacionado ao caráter epistêmico. Ela acaba de publicar um livro chamado The Right to Know, pela Routledge, e nesse livro ela tem uma abordagem muito sistemática, talvez a primeira abordagem tão sistemática assim, para tentar tratar, explicar a noção de direitos epistêmicos. E na carreira dela, nas publicações que se volta para esse lado sobre o caráter intelectual, tem uma certa ênfase, de modo geral, na educação de virtudes, e ela dá atenção especial ao papel e à noção de questionamento e o papel que o questionamento tem, tanto como atividade epistêmica, como ajudando no desenvolvimento de virtudes. Uma apresentação em inglês bem breve também. Professor Lani Watson is currently working as a fellow researcher at Oxford University, and there she contributes to the Oxford Character Project, which is an interdisciplinary project which have practical applications for the development of virtues. She has several publications on the epistemology of virtues. She has just published The Right to Know by Routledge, which offers a systematic approach to the notion of epistemic rights. And her publication as a whole, I think, place some emphasis on virtual education, but she pays special attention to the role that questions play on this education, also as an epistemic activity and in virtual development. So I'm very happy to have you here, Professor. You can start whenever you want.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that introduction, and apologies again for the slight technical mess up. I think I've solved it now. So hello, and thanks to everyone for being here. As you've just heard, I'm Dr. Lani Watson, and my work in epistemology focuses on questions and questioning. What questions are, why we ask them, and in particular, how we can become better questioners. So one important way that I think we can achieve this goal of becoming better questioners is by teaching good questioning in schools. And I think there are a whole bunch of good reasons for teaching good questioning in schools and in lots of other contexts. But one of the primary reasons that I have explored in my work is looking at the role that good questioning and teaching good questioning can play in the development of intellectual virtues and intellectual character. So that's what I'll be talking about today. Okay, so being a good questioner requires a degree of proficiency and judgment, both in determining what to ask and in deciding who, when, where, and how to ask. In other words, good questioning, in my view, is an intellectual skill. So strategies aimed at cultivating the intellectual virtues often focus on the development of the core skills that are required to exercise them. And good questioning, I argue, is one of those core skills, perhaps for a few of the intellectual virtues, perhaps even for many or all of the intellectual virtues. And I think that this makes good questioning a particularly rich and efficient tool for educators that are seeking to cultivate intellectual character in the classroom. So I'm going to begin, first of all, by just quickly examining this relationship between intellectual skills and intellectual virtues, and then look at kind of two key reasons why I think good questioning is an intellectual skill that is particularly rich for cultivating intellectual character. Okay, so with respect to the relationship between intellectual skills and intellectual virtues, I follow authors such as Linda Zagzebski and Robert Roberts and J. Wood in taking the intellectual virtues to be importantly related to or partly constituted by the intellectual skills. So part of what it is to be intellectually virtuous is to possess and exhibit certain intellectual skills. So Zagzebski, for example, writes that skills serve virtues by allowing a person who is virtuously motivated to be effective in action. Given that effectively exercising one's intellectual virtues under the appropriate circumstances is a requirement of being intellectually virtuous on Zagzebski's account of the virtues, intellectual skill is thereby necessary, although not sufficient, for intellectual virtue. Similarly, Roberts and Wood maintain that all virtues bear some relation or other to skills by which we negotiate generically human activities. So this close relationship between intellectual skills and intellectual virtues can be traced back to the Aristotelian account of the virtues, in which the intellectual virtues are seen to require a degree of skill that is learned or cultivated. Indeed, it is skill, at least in part, that distinguishes the virtuous from the non-virtuous. A person might be virtuously motivated and yet fail to possess intellectual virtue because they lack the intellectual skill required to act virtuously under the appropriate circumstances. As such, educating for intellectual skill is an essential aspect of educating for intellectual virtue. And it's unsurprisingly from the Aristotelian tradition also that the idea of educating for the intellectual virtues arises. So Aristotle writes this: both the coming into being and the increase of intellectual virtue result mostly from teaching. And it's because the intellectual virtues require a degree of skill in order to be intellectual virtues that I think they find a natural home in an educational environment where skills can be taught and practiced. And that's perhaps in contrast with educating for moral or even civic virtues. The teaching of intellectual skills in general can be viewed as a crucial stage in the cultivation of intellectually virtuous character. And like I say, I'm arguing that good questioning is one of the key intellectual skills to educate for in order to cultivate intellectually virtuous character. So before I'm going to go on to that argument, I'll just make a few quick comments to give you a sense of what I'm thinking of good questioning in more general terms, why I think this is an intellectual skill and what actually it is as an intellectual skill. Okay, so questioning can be broadly characterized as an intellectual skill. And for any type of skill, a person can be better or worse at executing it. Thus, when characterized as an intellectual skill, questioning can be more or less skilled by matter of degree. So what makes questioning more or less skilled? In other words, what makes questioning good or bad? So I argue that questions are information-seeking acts. A questioner acts in order to elicit information. A person can be more or less skilled at performing these acts, and accordingly, they'll be more or less skilled as a questioner. So the intellectual skill of good questioning arises when a person not only acts in order to elicit information, but they act competently in order to elicit worthwhile information. In other words, the good questioner acts competently in order to elicit worthwhile information. So a questioner acts competently when she makes appropriate judgments about who, when, where, and how to elicit information. The good questioner asks the right questions of the right information sources at the right time and place, and you can see the echo of Aristotle there. And a questioner elicits worthwhile information when she makes appropriate judgments about what information to elicit. So the good questioner avoids eliciting, say, trivial or disvaluable information, and she elicits information that is relevant or significant given her context. And it's in virtue of satisfying these constraints that the questioner transforms the activity of mere questioning into the intellectual skill of good questioning. The good questioner acts competently in order to elicit worthwhile information. So good questioning is an intellectual skill that allows us to successfully gather information. It enables us to effectively navigate our informational environment in order to identify and access the information that we need or want in a given situation. Perhaps from this alone, you can already see why I think that educating for good questioning is a rich resource for teaching in general, and for achieving certain key educational aims. Moreover, I argue that good questioning has two important roles in the cultivation of intellectual character. So firstly, good questioning stimulates intellectually virtuous inquiry. And secondly, good questioning contributes to the development of many, if not all, of the intellectual virtues. And I'm going to go through both of those claims in a little bit of detail now. Of course, there's a lot more detail in the paper that this is based on. So the first argument is not exactly difficult to make. And because I haven't got a huge amount of time, I won't go into a lot of detail. Again, it's in the paper in a little bit more detail. In broad terms, questioning as an activity in general often marks the beginning of inquiry, which involves both the asking and answering of questions. Indeed, the initiation of inquiry could be viewed as one of the most conspicuous and essential roles that questioning plays in our daily lives. So simply in virtue of its role in initiating inquiry, questioning generates opportunities for intellectually virtuous inquiry, because if there were fewer inquiries overall, there would likely be fewer intellectually virtuous inquiries. So it's just like a numbers game in a way. But the good questioner, moreover, elicits worthwhile information in a competent manner. And in doing so, they not only generate opportunities for intellectually virtuous inquiry, but they increase the likelihood of an inquiry being intellectually virtuous. That's because they ensure that the subject of an inquiry is worthwhile. For example, the good questioner helps to avoid the pursuit of trivial or disvaluable lines of inquiry. And the good questioner guards against initiating such inquiries by identifying the most worthwhile information in a given context. So similarly, by ensuring that an inquiry is initiated competently, the good questioner helps to reduce the likelihood of inquiry going astray, even when worthwhile information is being pursued. Moreover, questioning not only initiates, but it also guides and shapes inquiry. The questions that are asked once an inquiry has begun determine what information is pursued at each stage and how one goes about eliciting that information. It's precisely then the skill involved in good questioning that enables the good questioner to guard against common questioning pitfalls throughout inquiry. Things like asking for the wrong information, asking the wrong source or the wrong person, asking in the wrong way, and so on. In doing this, the good questioner increases the likelihood of intellectually virtuous inquiry. The role that good questioning plays in initiating and guiding intellectually virtuous inquiry is, of course, as significant in the classroom as it is in our daily lives. Without good questioning, opportunities for intellectually virtuous inquiry in the classroom will be less prevalent, and inquiry that does take place will be more likely to go astray. I think that's a simple but also a salient point. Good questioning has a valuable educative role to play in initiating and guiding intellectually virtuous inquiry, and therefore it has an important role to play in intellectual character education. Okay, so the second claim I'm defending in support of this broad contention that good questioning contributes to the development of intellectually virtuous character is the claim that as an intellectual skill, it features in many, if not all, of the individual intellectual virtues. So again, I go through, I think, 5 in the paper. For reasons of time, I'll just focus on 3 of those intellectual virtues, which I think have a kind of clear relationship to the intellectual skill of good questioning. And those are attentiveness, intellectual autonomy, and intellectual humility. So I'll begin with attentiveness. This virtue hasn't received a huge amount of attention among virtue epistemologists. I think that's changing a little bit, but it's it's sort of behind some of the other virtues in terms of attention that it's getting. But nonetheless, education practitioners typically view it as an important ingredient of classroom learning. So the student who is attentive to the teacher, the subject matter, or the class discussion is more likely to learn and engage than the student who isn't. Attentiveness both sustains and focuses inquiry. According to Jason Bear, moreover, virtuous attentiveness is not merely about paying attention to what the teacher is saying in the classroom. Over and above this, attentiveness is about actively engaging with and carefully attending to the details of one's environment or the subject matter under consideration, in order to pick out the details that matter in a given context. And in this way, the attentive person aids her own learning and advances her inquiries. But, and this is kind of the structure of all of these claims, this feature of virtuous attentiveness is shared by the intellectual skill of good questioning. In order to be a good questioner, a person must act competently in order to elicit worthwhile information. So good questioning requires a person to pay close attention to the details of her informational environment in order to discern which information is worth eliciting and which is not. And in this way, good questioning enables a person to effectively navigate her informational environment in order to access the information that she needs or wants. And it's this aspect of good questioning that makes it a form of virtuous attentiveness when performed under appropriate virtue relevant conditions. So imagine, for example, a student struggling with a mathematical equation. By encouraging the student to frame and articulate a question that picks out the information that he needs or wants, his teacher invites him to actively engage with the mathematical equation and attend to the details of the problem and its solution. And he must do this, at least to some degree, in order to frame and articulate a question that will competently target the information that he needs. In other words, he must do this in order to ask a good question. So it's precisely in attempting to formulate a good question that the student encounters an opportunity to exercise virtuous attentiveness. Once he's done that, he can be congratulated not only on asking a good question, but on asking an attentive one. So in common scenarios like that in the classroom, good questioning is itself a form of virtuous attentiveness. Educating for the intellectual skill of good questioning, therefore, provides opportunities for students to exhibit, practice, and refine the intellectual virtue of attentiveness. Okay, so take intellectual autonomy. As with attentiveness, intellectual autonomy can be regarded as an important ingredient of classroom learning. The intellectually autonomous person exercises her own will and judgment with respect to her intellectual pursuits. The student who does so plausibly aids her learning by identifying what is required for her in particular circumstances to, for example, pursue a line of inquiry or solve a particular problem. And in this way, she avoids irrelevant or unnecessary information and inefficient approaches. And at the same time, she becomes less reliant on others to advance her inquiries. Intellectual autonomy both directs inquiry and empowers the inquirer. In the classroom, intellectual autonomy can be observed in students who take the views or ideas of others on board before thinking through a problem for themselves. as well as those who contribute their own solutions rather than deferring to the solutions of other members of the class or the teacher. Less kind of overtly, but still importantly, the intellectually autonomous student might be one who simply reflects on the subject matter or thinks through a solution to a problem before assenting or corroborating another view or taking a position. So this intellectually autonomous attitude is also manifested by the student who engages in good questioning. Good questioning requires a person to determine which information in her environment is worth eliciting and which information isn't. And doing this gives her a degree of control over the information that she takes on board and the information that she avoids or ignores, empowering her to direct her own intellectual pursuits according to her will and judgment. Thus, the good questioner actively determines which information she needs or wants, rather than passively and indiscriminately absorbing whatever information is presented. Return to the student struggling with a mathematical equation. Once again, his teacher can encourage him to frame and articulate a question which picks out the information that he needs in order to move beyond whatever difficulty that he's having. In doing so, his teacher invites him to focus on the problem and its solution, rather than say simply providing him with the solution or providing him with the answer. And in this way, the student is given an opportunity to exercise his own will and judgment, determining the information that he already has and the information that he needs, and establishing the best way to pursue the information that he needs. He's invited essentially to think it through for himself. And the student must do this in order to frame and articulate a question that competently targets the information that he needs, the worthwhile information. In other words, he must do this in order to ask a good question. And again, it's precisely in attempting to formulate a good question that the student encounters an opportunity to exercise intellectual autonomy. In common scenarios like this, good questioning is itself a form of intellectual autonomy. Indeed, I think it's arguably a paradigmatic form of the virtue. Educating for the intellectual skill of good questioning thereby provides students with the opportunity to exhibit, practice, and refine the virtue of intellectual autonomy. Okay, finally, let's just look at intellectual humility, more popular virtue in recent years, and it's received notable attention with several accounts emerging. So Robertson Wood, for example, characterized intellectual humility in the kind of purely negative terms as an absence of the vices of pride. Whitcomb, Batterley and Bear, on the other hand, characterize it in terms of owning one's intellectual limitations. And that's the approach that I am myself inclined towards. But to be honest, whichever of these approaches or others one adopts, I don't think it's hard to appreciate the close relationship between intellectual humility and good questioning. At a basic level, questioning requires a person to recognize that she's lacking some information that she needs or wants. And good questioning requires a person to recognize that the information is worthwhile. Thus, the good questioner must recognize an important gap in her knowledge or understanding, and doing so will often, perhaps typically, amount to intellectual humility. This is especially apparent given that, for the most part, we're operating under a system that values knowing things highly. Knowledge is power, right? So questioning requires the person to identify precisely what it is that she doesn't yet know. And good questioning requires a person to identify what it is that she doesn't yet know and recognize that it's worth knowing. Moreover, given that questioning is in essence a social practice, good questioning will frequently require a person to openly and publicly expose the fact that she doesn't know something that she needs or wants to know. And then in any number of situations where there exists a real or perceived expectation that one already does know this or that thing, exposing the fact that one doesn't by asking a question exhibits intellectual humility. So this relationship between good questioning and intellectual humility is, I think, particularly clear in the classroom. Students often feel under pressure, rightly or wrongly, to have the right answers at their immediate disposal, and they can be especially unwilling or hesitant to expose the fact that they don't know or understand something. So again, a student struggling with the mathematical equation may be unwilling to admit to himself or to others that he's struggling. He may be suffering from a degree of arrogance or pride, and so fail to notice that his struggle is resulting from his own lack of information or ability. In such a case, his teacher, as before, can encourage the student to frame and articulate a question that picks out the information he needs in order to move beyond the difficulty. In doing so, she encourages him to both actively contemplate and consciously expose the fact that he's lacking some information or ability. She indicates, moreover, that doing this is expected, even commendable, and will be beneficial. In order to frame and articulate a good question, the student has to acknowledge and expose the fact that he's lacking something that he needs and thereby own his intellectual limitations. And again, it's precisely in attempting to formulate a good question then that the student encounters an opportunity to exercise intellectual humility. In doing so, he can be congratulated on his willingness to recognize and own his intellectual limitations. In scenarios like this, good questioning is itself a form of intellectual humility. Educating for the intellectual skill of good questioning thereby provides students with the opportunity to exhibit, practice, and refine the virtue of intellectual humility. Okay, so I've focused on just 3 of the intellectual virtues, and I've argued that in each case, under the right virtue relevant conditions, good questioning is a form of the intellectual virtue in question. And I believe actually that a similar case can be made for many, if not all, of the intellectual virtues. In the paper, I also talk about intellectual courage and inquisitiveness, and I think open-mindedness and curiosity are also, in some ways, I didn't talk about inquisitiveness and curiosity here because they seem like I kind of feel like I get them for free because good questioning is so clearly a part of these intellectual virtues. So, you know, if you buy what I've said about the 3 that we've talked about, you buy what I think I've said about inquisitiveness and curiosity, you know, you can see that we could probably get quite far down the list of intellectual virtues. In any case, I think just the 3 that I've argued for today should give educators invested in educating for intellectual character reason to educate for good questioning. So in conclusion, I have argued that the intellectual skill of good questioning provides a rich resource for cultivating intellectual character, and thus that educating for good questioning should form an integral part of any character education that is concerned with the intellectual development of students in the classroom. Thank you very much. Here's some references, and that's me.
Thank you, Professor. So now we have our question section. It's open. The way we're doing, anybody that wants can ask the question. If you want in the chat, or you can ask you directly if you wishes. So first question in the chat from Celso de Oliveira. He asks the following: how can one certainly know what information is trivial before having the answer? And there are no circumstances in which the good questioner needs certain ingenuity. Insights, for instance, cease to be possible good questions. That's the first one from Celso de Oliveira.
Great, thanks very much, Celso. Yeah, so I definitely don't want to claim that we can know what information is trivial before having the answer. And I mean, even I don't even know if we really have a good grasp on what information is trivial at all, even when we have the answers. because, you know, like these kind of examples that come up in the literature, things like counting the grains of sand on a beach, or counting the motes of dust on my desk. It's not even clear to me that those are necessarily trivial, right? There might be good reasons to do that kind of thing. It might be like calming to count the motes of dust, you know, and that might help you to solve a problem. I don't know, yeah, but I think it's a very difficult question. So in some sense, all I'm relying on is that we think that there is some information that's more worthwhile than other information in certain contexts. And as long as that's the case, then it seems like in terms of when we're asking questions, we should try to seek out the information that's more worthwhile than the information that isn't. But that kind of point made and bracketed, I take it that this question is still like presenting a kind of a paradox. How can we rely on that judgment capacity in our formulation of questions if we don't know what the answer is ultimately going to be? And I completely recognize that paradox. The way I sort of want to think of it is more like there is it seems like, for example, if I want to catch the next train to London, then asking the train guard on the platform what he had for breakfast is going to be significantly less worthwhile. And it's not that I need to know the answer, you know, that the next train to London is at 5 o'clock. But I can still judge before asking that, like, yeah, it's going to be more useful for me to ask when is the next train to London than it is to ask what did you have for breakfast. And that's a really crude example. And of course, like, easy with that kind of crude example. That's just to kind of resolve the, you know, to suggest that it's not as paradoxical as it sounds. But I appreciate that it's going to get very much more messy with like much more nuanced things. And at that point, what I'm interested in arguing is that actually a huge amount of the skill involved in good questioning is in trying to figure out, okay, what kind of information I'm looking for, what kind of information is going to be worth having, because often we spend a lot of time asking the wrong questions because we're looking for the wrong information. And if we spent more time thinking about the question at the outset, we would maybe have more efficient, more competent information seeking at the end. So I hope that kind of helps to address it, but I do recognize this kind of almost paradoxical problem.
Now, Alexandre, Diana wants to ask you a question directly. Alexandre?
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Watson, for your presentation. I have two questions. The first one, do you plan to do empirical research to give support for your conjectures? And the second one is, I was wondering if your if what you propose here today cannot be read as something like skills need to be first, and character education need to be something which emerges from this, from skills first.
Yeah, thanks, Alexandra. So yeah, good questions. The question about empirical work, I mean, yeah, I would absolutely I'd love to have like a huge like team and lots of people that could do a ton of empirical work here. And I think that could really help to further the argument. I've done a little bit of empirical work myself, but not, nowhere near enough to test anything like this. Interestingly, I don't know if you're familiar with this kind of work, but most of the work on questions, certainly most of the empirical work on questions, is in education. And it happened in the kind of 70s and 80s. There was like a kind of a flood of empirical work on questioning in education. And sorry, student questioning in education, I should say, not teacher questioning. There's tons of work on teacher questioning, but student questioning in education, there was a kind of flurry of interest in the 70s and 80s, at least in like the UK and the United States. And then for some reason that work hasn't continued, and it's dropped off, and there hasn't been a huge amount of empirical work since then. So I think that this argument, you know, in each of these cases is a kind of premise for empirical work that we can and ideally would be doing. I actually wrote a grant proposal to do precisely that, but it wasn't, well, at that point it wasn't successful. So it's still an ongoing, something which I would really like to pursue. And secondly, yeah, in terms of skills first, I suppose partly what I'm invested in is, it seems like it's maybe a little bit simpler to do the skills piece than the kind of motivation piece or even the affective piece in terms of educating for character. That's definitely not to say that we shouldn't be focusing on the whole picture. And one thing if I was only interested in the skills, you know, I'd be at critical thinking conferences rather than intellectual character conferences. So definitely I'm interested in the whole picture, and I've got some thoughts and ideas about how we can educate for the motivation component. I just think it's like so much harder to do. And in the meantime, if we can get some of this basic skills into the picture, then that's a good start. But it's a start in terms of like practically a good start rather than like conceptually foundational or fundamental.
Thank you, Alexandre. Now from Eduardo Cis, he says the following: virtual epistemology still faces the situationally challenged regarding the absence of empirical evidence for the existence of intellectual virtues, which is the more skeptical view regarding the subject. Do you believe that the possibility of teaching how to ask good questioning and consequently train good questioners can contribute as empirical evidence for the existence of intellectual virtues like curiosity, for instance?
Yeah, it's a great question, and yeah, and again, this question of doing empirical work, which I really think would be very worthwhile. It would be super surprising to me if, you know, if you could teach students in schools to ask good questions in a really kind of robust, systematic, and kind of embedded long-term way, and then they didn't develop some of these intellectual virtues. But of course, you know, there isn't, like we've said, the empirical evidence isn't there. There is some like teacher testimony on that. There's an organization called the Right Question Institute based in Boston, connections with Harvard. And they've got some amazing teacher testimonial about teaching students to ask good questions. And some of that, it certainly reads to me as if it's intellectual character. I suppose if we can use that to sort of establish the existence of intellectual character via establishing that, you know, individuals can go from being less, you know, attentive to more attentive, or less curious to more curious, that could do something to help respond to the situationist critique. And I suppose there's like a more general point there, isn't there, like around, it might be the case that, yeah, just showing changes in intellectual character traits can be a way to give us an impression of how they actually are responsive to educational practices, rather than merely to, I mean, it depends how broad you take the situation to be, right? But yeah, I think that's a very interesting possibility.
sorry. The next one is from Lucas Bispo, which says, thanks for being here and for the presentation. What can we do in the classroom as philosophy professors, specifically? If we want our classes to be educational spaces for good questioning, could you please share something about this?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question. So I think, well, I mean, one thing definitely is to, again, give a shout out to the Right Question Institute in Boston. They have a really good technique called the question formulation technique, which you can look it up, and you can buy their kind of short book, or they've got a really good website as well, and that gives a really nice kind of way to access a particular technique for teaching good questioning. Their kind of focuses on primary and secondary education rather than higher education. But I think, I've used it in the higher education context as well, like it can be adapted. And I've observed it in a lot of classrooms, and it's a very good technique, I think. From my point of view, I think there are one of the key kind of things that I'm interested in, I guess, arguing and advocating for is what I call a switch between what I call a answer-oriented education system and a question-oriented education system. And when I say education system, also I mean world, but answer-oriented to question-oriented. And all I mean by that is that our education system at the moment, certainly in the UK, is heavily focused on teaching students to answer questions and not teaching them to ask questions. So shifting towards the question orientation requires, I think, a number of things. Firstly, it requires less teacher questioning. And I mentioned that there's a lot of literature on teacher questioning. There's a lot of pedagogical resources for teacher questioning. I think that's all good. Teachers need to be good questioners. But the balance, in terms of that, the teacher questioning to student questioning is completely off. And there's a huge amount of work and literature and studies and empirical work on teacher questioning. And there's really very little on student questioning. The work that I referenced earlier, the empirical work from the 70s and 80s, what it shows is that students don't ask questions in classrooms, and that there's a correlation between the amount of questions that teachers ask and the amount of questions that students ask. So the more questions that the teacher asks, the less questions the student asks. And that's it's very intuitive when you think about it, that of course, if you're the one asking the question as a teacher, then your student is put in the position of being the answerer, not the questioner. So they're developing lots of great skills in answering questions, but not in asking questions. So I think even really simply shifting that dynamic and making it the case that the students are asking the questions and not the teacher, that's an important way to do it. I know that this some people have done this, and I've certainly done this, by requiring students to arrive at a class, especially in like a university class, with questions based on the material, and using the student questions from the outset as a guide for the discussion or whatever it is, the activity. And I think finally, the final piece of that puzzle is around assessment practices. So even kind of summative assessment, not necessarily the formative assessments, I think that would be great. But a lot of teachers, that's not an option. You don't have control over the formative assessment, the summative assessment, sorry, getting those wrong, the final, graded assessments, but you do have control over the formative assessments. And using student questions in formative assessment is a way to get students to get into the habit, oh, okay, I'm going to be expected to come with my questions, and I'm going to be expected to, and I'm even going to be assessed, formatively, but I'm going to be assessed on the basis of my questions, because those questions are telling you, okay, what does this student actually know about the subject matter, and what information do they not yet know? They're such a rich resource of questions of like giving you an idea of what it is that students do and don't understand about something. So using questions in formative assessment is another, I think, good option. I could go on and on about this, but I won't. But yeah, it's a great question.
I like that. I like those advice a lot. We have a question now from Professor Tanazin.
In the chat, there is a secondary question, so perhaps Lani should take that first.
Yeah, maybe. Veronica is asking a follow-up question from Lucas' question. How do you show someone that the question she's asking is the wrong question to be asked? You know, sometimes we ask someone a question and the person gives us an answer that is slightly different from what we want to know. It also happens that we sometimes ask a question that is slightly different from what we should be asking in order to get the response we need. Does the technique you described help to solve this?
Yeah, that's a great follow-up question, Veronica. I think one thing that I have like a slight bee in my bonnet about is this phrase like, oh, there are no stupid questions, you know, because I think it's actually quite important. I mean, of course, you don't want people to feel stupid and you want to remove that barrier. But I think it's quite important that people understand actually questioning is a skill. It's a skill and it's quite hard. I don't know if you've ever tried to do this, but if you put students on the spot or anyone on the spot to ask, you know, questions, it can be quite a challenge, and especially if there's an expectation that they're kind of like good questions. And so kind of almost doing the opposite of there are no stupid questions, but doing it in a kind way to say like, listen, we're all going to ask, you know, questions that aren't on target right at the start, but we're going to be able to refine those questions. We're going to be able to develop those questions, and we're going to use different tips and techniques. So yeah, the technique that I described, it uses at the outset, it uses a set of rules for generating questions, and I call that, and it's called elsewhere, question storming. Question storming is like brainstorming, so it's like just throwing out lots and lots of questions in a really short space of time in response to a prompt. And what that does is it gives students this like way of, they start thinking in questions, they start generating lots and lots and lots of questions, and then the important thing is that you look at that first list that was generated in haste and you say, right, okay, which of these questions do we want and which of these questions aren't actually what we want, and you start to refine. So the first question is not taken to be the right question. It's like you get students into a habit of thinking, yeah, I mean, my first question was just the first shot in the dark, and I'm going to work on it until I sort of improved it to the extent I feel now this is the right question. And I think helping students to understand that there's a skill there and that it can be developed, and that it has all these positive consequences is a way to sort of, deal with the problem that you're pointing towards.
Professor Tanzin now with the last question.
Hi, Lani, thanks. I just, it's a bit of a curveball, but I'm just curious to see what you think. You know that one of the mottos of QAnon is do your own research. So, I mean, I take it you would say, you know, even given their epistemic goals, they're asking the wrong questions, so to speak. But there is also just an interesting question of knowing when we should be inquisitive and when instead we should not do our own research and defer. And there is at the moment, I think there's a lot of interest in philosophy about this idea that, you know, always promoting individual inquisitiveness rather than promoting knowing when you shouldn't be intellectually autonomous, when you should just simply defer, is also an important virtuous intellectual skill to have. And I was wondering whether you you agree with this, and whether you've got anything to say about whether, you know, we should be inquisitive, but not all the time, and how do we know when not to be inquisitive?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Alessandra, thanks. And I'm sure I could talk about it much longer than 2 minutes that I've got, but the headline is that inquisitiveness, curiosity, like any of the virtues, should be on a mean. And I think that is, like, I'm glad you raised it, because quite often I think I kind of failed to communicate that when I'm talking about questions, that like the goal here is not ask more questions. It's not necessarily that students need to ask more questions. In fact, I think it is, because of the dynamic between teacher and student. But in general, in life, and to some extent in the classroom, it's not about asking more and more and more questions. It's about asking the right questions. And that's really the like key evaluative criteria, what I think of as a content component for like good questioning, and therefore how that manifests in the virtues like inquisitiveness and curiosity and intellectual autonomy, and these things that we can see in the kind of conspiracy theorizing QAnon sort of mode, has got to be moderated by I think to some extent by this like slightly mysterious thing that we still haven't unpacked, and we haven't unpacked it here. It hasn't been unpacked, I think, in epistemology at large. And it goes back to the first question about what is it to be worthwhile information, and what is it to be like disvaluable or unhelpful or trivial or whatever it is information. And there's got to be some information out there which we really shouldn't be pursuing for whatever reason, I think. And that should feature in virtuous inquisitiveness.
Would it be okay to follow up very briefly, Arthur? So I think it's slightly different. So I take it that however worthwhile information is defined has to be relative to the epistemic goals of the inquiry, right? So then it seems to me that for somebody to elicit worthwhile information, given the goals of their inquiry, but they're just engaging in inquiry when they shouldn't, right? So they are still asking the good questions, i.e. questions that elicit worthwhile information because of the inquiry they're engaging in. But it would be best if they didn't engage in inquiry.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, no, I understand that. So I think that like, I guess the short version of what I'm sort of saying is like that part of good questioning is sometimes not questioning. It should be the case that sometimes not questioning is, in a weird way, good questioning. So yeah, I think that's right in terms of, whether your worthwhile information is indexed to your goals. That I think, like in a way, I think that ends up like bottoming out in the question of whether we think that the epistemic virtues are a subset of the moral virtues or are completely distinct. And I'm not really sure exactly where I stand, to be honest, on that. In some respects, I'm inclined to think that they are a subset of the moral virtues, and that means that there is a kind of moral component in the background when you're trying to determine which epistemic goals we should be pursuing. But yeah, we can talk about that for a long time, of course.
Thank you, Lani. Thank you so much for the presentation. Such a nice talk. We're gonna have the Veronica presenting her one more talk for us. You, of course, are welcome to stay, and if you can, of course. And I'm gonna be speaking Portuguese first, then I make a brief presentation of Veronica. Então, pessoal, a gente agora começa com a apresentação da Verônica. Você já está como co-host, tá, Verônica? Se você quiser compartilhar uma tela.
Ah, tá. Você me ouve?
Ouço alguma... Peraí, deixa eu aproveitar e interromper a gravação.